Chapter 4 Masks. Kull sat upon his throne and gazed brutally out upon the sea of faces turned toward him. A courtier was speaking in evenly modulated tones, but the king scarcely heard him. Close by, too, chief counselor stood ready at Kull's command, and each time the king looked at him, Kull shuddered inwardly. The surface of court life was as the unrippled surface of the sea between tide and tide. To the musing king, the affairs of the night before seemed as a dream until his eyes dropped to the arm of his throne. A brown, sinewy hand rested there, upon the wrist of which gleamed a dragon armlet. Brule stood beside his throne, and ever the Pict's fierce secret whisper brought him back from the realm of unreality in which he moved. No, that was no dream, that monstrous interlude. As he sat upon his throne in the hall of society and gazed upon the courtiers, the ladies, the lords, the statesmen, he seemed to see their faces as things of illusion, things unreal, existent only as shadows and mockeries of substance. Always he had seen their faces as masks, but before he had looked on them with contemptuous tolerance, thinking to see beneath the masks shallow, puny souls, avaricious, lustful, deceitful. Now there was a grim undertone, a sinister meaning, a vague horror that lurked beneath the smooth masks. While he exchanged courtesies with some nobleman or counselor, he seemed to see the smiling face fade like smoke, and the frightful jaws of a serpent gaping there. How many of those he looked upon were horrid inhuman monsters plotting his death beneath the smooth mesmeric illusion of a human face. Valusia, land of dreams and nightmares, a kingdom of the shadows ruled by phantoms who glided back and forth behind the painted curtains, mocking the futile king who sat upon the throne, himself a shadow. And like a comrade shadow, Brule stood by his side, dark eyes glittering from immobile face. A real man, Brule, and Kull felt his friendship for the savage become a thing of reality, and sensed that Brule felt a friendship for him beyond the mere necessity of statecraft. And what, mused Kull, were the realities of life? Ambition, power, pride, the friendship of man, the love of women, which Kull had never known, battle, plunder, what? Was it the real Kull who sat upon the throne, or was it the real Kull who had scaled the hills of Atlantis, harried the far isles of the sunset, and laughed upon the green roaring tides of the Atlantean Sea? How could a man be so many different men in a lifetime? For Kull knew that there were many Kulls, and he wondered which was the real Kull. After all, the priests of the serpent merely went a step further in their magic, for all men wore masks, and many a different mask with each different man or woman. And Kull wondered if a serpent did not lurk under every mask. So he sat and brooded in strange, mazy thought-ways, and the courtiers came and went, and the minor affairs of the day were completed, until at last the king and Brule sat alone in the hall of society, save for the drowsy attendants. Kull felt a weariness. Neither he nor Brule had slept the night before, nor had Kull slept the night before that, when in the gardens of Kanu he had had his first hint of the weird things to be. Last night nothing further had occurred after they had returned to the study-room from the secret corridors, but they had neither dared nor cared to sleep. Kull, with the incredible vitality of a wolf, had aforetime gone for days upon days without sleep in his wild, savage days, but now his mind was edged from constant thinking and from the nerve-breaking eeriness of the past night. He needed sleep, but sleep was furthest from his mind. And he would not have dared sleep if he had thought of it. Another thing that had shaken him was the fact that though he and Brule had kept a close watch to see if, or when, the study-room guard was changed, yet it was changed without their knowledge, for the next morning those who stood on guard were able to repeat the magic words of Brule, but they remembered nothing out of the ordinary. They thought that they had stood at guard all night, as usual, and Kull said nothing to the contrary. He believed them true men, but Brule had advised absolute secrecy, and Kull also thought it best. Now Brule leaned over the throne, lowering his voice so not even a lazy attendant could hear. "They will strike soon, I think, Kull. A while ago, Canute gave me a secret sign. The priests know that we know of their plot, of course, but they know not how much we know. We must be ready for any sort of action. Canute and the Pictish chiefs will remain within hailing distance now until this is settled one way or another. Ha, Kull, if it comes to a pitched battle, the streets and the castles of Valusia will run red." Kull smiled grimly. He would greet any sort of action with a ferocious joy. This wandering in a labyrinth of illusion and magic was extremely irksome to his nature. He longed for the leap and clang of swords, for the joyous freedom of battle. Then into the hall of society came two again, and the rest of the councillors. "Lord King, the hour of the council is at hand, and we stand ready to escort you to the council room." Kull rose, and the councillors bent the knee as he passed through the way opened by them for his passage, rising behind him and following. Eyebrows were raised as the Pict strode defiantly behind the king, but no one dissented. Brule's challenging gaze swept the smooth faces of the councillors with the defiance of an intruding savage. The group passed through the halls and came at last to the council chamber. The door was closed, as usual, and the councillors arranged themselves in the order of their rank before the dais upon which stood the king. Like a bronze statue, Brule took up his stand behind Kull. Kull swept the room with a swift stare. Surely no chance of treachery here. 17 councillors there were, all known to him. All of them had espoused his cause when he ascended the throne. "Men of Valusia," he began in the conventional manner, then halted, perplexed. The councillors had risen as a man and were moving toward him. There was no hostility in their looks, but their actions were strange for a council room. The foremost was close to him when Brule sprang forward, crouched like a leopard. "Kanama Ka'alajarama!" His voice crackled through the sinister silence of the room, and the foremost councillor recoiled, hand flashing to his robes. And, like a spring released, Brule moved, and the man pitched headlong and lay still, while his face faded and became the head of a mighty snake. "Slay, Kull!" rasped the Pict's voice. "They be all serpent men!" The rest was a scarlet maze. Kull saw the familiar faces, dim like fading fog, and in their places gaped horrid reptilian visages as the whole band rushed forward. His mind was dazed, but his giant body faltered not. The singing of his sword filled the room, and the onrushing flood broke in a red wave. But they surged forward again, seemingly willing to fling their lives away in order to drag down the king. Hideous jaws gaped at him, terrible eyes blazed into his unblinkingly. A frightful fetid scent pervaded the atmosphere, the serpent scent that Kull had known in southern jungles. Swords and daggers leaped at him, and he was dimly aware that they wounded him, but Kull was in his element. Never before had he faced such grim foes, but it mattered little. They lived, their veins held blood that could be spilt, and they died when his great sword cleft their skulls or drove through their bodies. Slash, thrust, thrust and swing. Yet Kull had died there but for the man who crouched at his side, parrying and thrusting. For the king was clear berserk, fighting in the terrible Atlantean way that seeks death to deal death. he made no effort to avoid thrusts and slashes, standing straight up and ever plunging forward, no thought in his frenzied mind but to slay. Not often did Kull forget his fighting craft in his primitive fury, but now some chain had broken in his soul, flooding his mind with the red wave of slaughterlust. He slew a foe at each blow, but they surged about him, and time and again Brule turned a thrust that would have slain, as he crouched beside Kull, parrying and warding with cold skill, slaying not as Kull slew, with long slashes and plunges, but with short overhand blows and upward thrusts. Kull laughed, a laugh of insanity. The frightful faces swirled about him in a scarlet blaze. He felt steel sink into his arm, and dropped his sword in a flashing arc that cleft his foe to the breastbone. Then the mists faded, and the king saw that he and Brule stood alone, above a sprawl of hideous crimson figures who lay still upon the floor. "Valka, what a killing!" said Brule, shaking the blood from his eyes. "Kull, had these been warriors who knew how to use the steel, we had died here. These serpent priests know naught of swordcraft, and die easier than any men I ever slew. Yet had there been a few more, I think the matter had ended otherwise." Kull nodded. The wild berserker blaze had passed, leaving a mazed feeling of great weariness. Blood seeped from wounds on breast, shoulder, arm, and leg. Brule, himself bleeding from a score of flesh wounds, glanced at him in some concern. "Lord Kull, let us hasten to have your wounds dressed by the women." Kull thrust him aside with the drunken sweep of his mighty arm. "Nay, we will see this through ere we cease. Go you, though, and have your wounds seen to. I command it." The Pict laughed grimly. "Your wounds are more than mine, Lord King," he began, then stopped as a sudden thought struck him. "By Valka, Kull, this is not the council room." Kull looked about, and suddenly other fogs seemed to fade. "Nay, this is the room where Ilal died 1,000 years ago, since unused and named accursed." "Then by the gods, they tricked us after all!" exclaimed Brule in a fury, kicking the corpses at their feet. "They caused us to walk like fools into their ambush. By their magic they changed the appearance of all." "Then there is further deviltry afoot," said Kull. "For if there be true men in the councils of Valusia, they should be in the real council room now. Come swiftly." And, leaving the room with its ghastly keepers, they hastened through halls that seemed deserted until they came to the real council room. Then Kull halted with a ghastly shudder. From the council room sounded a voice speaking, and the voice was his. With the hand that shook, he parted the tapestries and gazed into the room. There sat the councillors, counterparts of the men he and Brule had just slain, and upon the dais stood Kull, king of Valusia. He stepped back, his mind reeling. "This is insanity," he whispered. "Am I Kull? Do I stand here, or is that Kull yonder in very truth, and I am but a shadow, a figment of thought?" Brule's hand clutching his shoulder, shaking him fiercely, brought him to his senses. "Valka's name, be not a fool! Can you yet be astounded after all we've seen? See you not that those are true men, bewitched by a snake man who has taken your form, as those others took their forms? By now you should have been slain, and yon monster reigning in your stead, unknown by those who bowed to you. Leap and slay swiftly, or else we are undone. The red slayers, true men, stand close on each hand, and none but you can reach and slay him. Be swift!" Kull shook off the onrushing dizziness, flung back his head in the old defiant gesture. He took a long, deep breath, as does a strong swimmer before diving into the sea. Then, sweeping back the tapestries, made the dais in a single lion-like bound. Brule had spoken truly. There stood men of the Red Slayers, guardsmen trained to move quick as the striking leopard. Any but Kull had died ere he could reach the usurper. but the sight of Kull, identical with the man upon the dais, held them in their tracks, their minds stunned for an instant, and that was long enough. He upon the dais snatched for his sword, but even as his fingers closed upon the hilt, Kull's sword stood out behind his shoulders, and the thing that men had thought the king pitched forward from the dais to lie silent upon the floor. "Hold!" Kull's lifted hand and kingly voice stopped the rush that had started, and while they stood astounded, he pointed to the thing which lay before them, whose face was fading into that of a snake. They recoiled, and from one door came Brule, and from another came Canute. These grasped the king's bloody hand, and Canute spoke. "Men of Valusia, you have seen with your own eyes. This is the true Kull, the mightiest king to whom Valusia has ever bowed. The power of the serpent is broken, and ye be all true men. King Kull, have you commands?" "Lift that carrion," said Kull, and men of the guard took up the thing. "Now follow me," said the king, and he made his way to the accursed room. Brule, with a look of concern, offered the support of his arm, but Kull shook him off. The distance seemed endless to the bleeding king, but at last he stood at the door and laughed fiercely and grimly when he heard the horrified ejaculations of the councillors. At his orders, the guardsmen flung the corpse they carried beside the others, and motioning all from the room, Kull stepped out last and closed the door. A wave of dizziness left him shaken. The faces turned to him, pallid and wondering, swirled and mingled in a ghostly fog. He felt the blood from his wound trickling down his limbs, and he knew that what he was to do he must do quickly or not at all. His sword rasped from its sheath. "Brule, are you there?" "Aye." Brule's face looked at him through the mist, close to his shoulder, but Brule's voice sounded leagues and eons away. "Remember our vow, Brule, and now bid them stand back." His left arm cleared a space as he flung up his sword. Then, with all his waning power, he drove it through the door into the jamb, driving the great sword to the hilt and sealing the room forever. Legs braced wide, he swayed drunkenly, facing the horrified councillors. "Let this room be doubly accursed, and let those rotting skeletons lie there forever as a sign of the dying might of the serpent. Here I swear that I shall hunt the serpent men from land to land, from sea to sea, giving no rest until all be slain, that good triumph and the power of hell be broken. This thing I swear, I, Kull, King of Valusia." His knees buckled as the faces swayed and swirled. The councillors leaped forward, but ere they could reach him, Kull slumped to the floor and lay still, face upward. The councillors surged about the fallen king, chattering and shrieking. Canute beat them back with his clenched fists, cursing savagely. "Back, you fools! Would you stifle the little life that is yet in him? How, Brule? Is he dead, or will he live?" to the warrior who bent above the prostrate Kull. "Dead?" sneered Brule irritably. "Such a man as this is not so easily killed. Lack of sleep and loss of blood have weakened him. By Valka, he has a score of deep wounds, but none of them mortal. Yet have those gibbering fools bring the courtwomen here at once." Brule's eyes lighted with a fierce, proud light. "Valka, Canute, but here is such a man as I knew not existed in these degenerate days. He will be in the saddle in a few scant days, and then may the serpent men of the world beware of Kull of Valusia. Valka, but that will be a rare hunt. I see long years of prosperity for the world with such a king."